my pleasure and honour indeed to welcome Canon Gunn with us in this wonderful section of little addresses that the Parish Pastoral Council has helped organise so successfully. And this is one of great interest to all of us here in this Holywood, Sanctus Boscus area. And so I'm going to hold over with my welcome to my brother priest here and to all of you over to Jerry, who will address us. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Father Stephen, again. Very welcome, Canon. Canon Joe completed the studies for the priesthood in the Irish College in Rome and then was ordained in the Sacred Heart Church in 1980. His first year as a priest was spent as a curate in St Mary's on the Hill in Glengormley. He then spent a year doing a postgraduate certificate in education at St Joseph's College before being appointed to a teaching post in St Magnesius College in Garntower, where he taught French and RE. After 2 years teaching, Canon Joe then took up an appointment as a Catholic chaplain at Queen's University and remained there in post from 1984 to 2003. And during those 19 years, I believe it was standing room only at the Sunday night evening Mass in the Catholic chaplaincy during those years. I remember meeting you, Father, in the early 90s when you came to address the sixth form in Downpatrick. Don't know if you remember that or not, where I taught then. In 2003, you were appointed PP in Newton Ards. It's good to see a lot of parishioners here from Newton Ards tonight. And then you took up, you remained there until 2009, and then you became PP in St Comglas in Bangor, your present post. In 2015, you were elevated to a position of Canon in Bobbio, Italy, before being made Canon earlier this year in our own diocese in Down and Connor. It gives me great pleasure, Canon, to welcome you again here tonight, and we look forward to hearing your talk on our rich Christian heritage, living our rich Christian heritage. Thank you, Canon.
Thank you very much for the kind welcome and those very kind introductory remarks. Now, I'm going to do what I'm very bad at, which is try and keep time, and because otherwise I could keep you here all night, and that would not be a very good idea or very pleasant for you. I'm very conscious of the fact that the finest historian of the 19th century in this diocese lies buried outside Monsignor O'Laverty. And I also want to start with a story that I read in the Irish News in the On This Day section, which was edited by Eamon Phoenix, who, as you know, died 2 days ago and will be buried on Friday. A wonderful gentleman and a wonderful historian. And the story goes like this. It was about 1912, 1915, somewhere like that. And a man was up in court for careless driving. And the case was proceeding, and an RIC sergeant was produced for the defence. And he said, now this is for the defence, remember, he said, well, of course he had an accident. Sure, wasn't he drunk? And but at the same time, that sergeant would have been responsible for enforcing the offences against any offences against the Protection of the Person Act of 1849, I think it was, and which outlawed abortion. Now, spool forward, not quite 110 years, and now the situation is totally reversed. That same sergeant would be out prosecuting anyone for drink driving, and now has to promote the right of someone to have an abortion, which would have been forbidden by the legislation in the 19th century. I use that story to show how cultural things change and change radically. And when we're talking about the living Christian tradition of Ireland, we have to bear in mind that things switch back to an incredible degree. I also want to quote Professor Corish, another great Irish historian, former head of Maynooth, and he had two great sayings. One was, there's only so far you can push religion into anybody. And the second one was, you should never ordain the pious fool because he could lose his piety. Terribly wise. And then when we come, there's another, I'm adapting this from an American political statement. The political statement was that political platforms are for running on, not for standing on. And I think that's the same thing about our religious heritage and tradition. And then there's the comforting power of myth. And myth takes our fondest imaginings and translates them into spurious historical fact from which we will not be budged by any sort of argument. So our religious myth very often talks about our glorious past, our dreadful persecutions, and all of these reveal a latent nobility in ourselves and definitely a moral superiority. And this is vitally important for a community like ours, which has been a minority. And all this myth is something that we just absorb until it runs up against reality. And then we are in a different ball game altogether. Another commentator said that there are two great non-negotiables in our Irish system. The first one is identity, and the second one is religion. And neither of them is constant. And where did our identity and our religion come from? Well, first of all, we have to look at the world and see it through different eyes. See the oceans not as obstacles, but see the oceans as means of communication. And with that, we then can understand how easily the monasticism which began at the beginning of our Christian story in Ireland, that monasticism came from Egypt. And the monks who set up this new system of religious life were heavily influenced by Egyptian precedent. And then we have the story of, in our local area, in about 555 perhaps, St. Comgall founds Bangor. And from Bangor comes Columbanus, who goes out along with Gaul to Europe. Then, of course, we have Columkill, to whom this church is dedicated, a rough contemporary of Columbanus, but certainly a contemporary of Comgall. And the two of them sank their political differences because Comgall was from a minor group which was in competition to the O'Neills, the family would be O'Neills, from which Columkill came. The two of them sank their differences and they went on mission. It didn't succeed and Comgall came back. But we see straight away this missionary impulse in this new religion which had arrived. And remember that Ireland was only considered a Christian country from about 700 AD, and yet here in the middle of the 6th century we have this missionary impulse going, which persists in our Irish tradition right to the present day. Then we have again this wonderful community of Bangor, Movilla and Nendrum. These three monasteries which helped one another. Nendrum was at the cutting edge of technology. It was in Nendrum that we have the first horizontal mills used to harness the energy of the Loch, which has the second fastest flow in Europe after Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy. And they produced the grain, which kept Movilla and Bangor alive. They were interesting examples of what the Irish monasteries were. The monasteries were places of prayer, of study, and because there were no towns or cities in Ireland, they were economic centres and manufacturing centres. There were open prisons for people who had to be dealt with by the legal system. They were offered sanctuary to people who had fallen foul of the local kings. They were hospitals. They were asylums. And sources of wealth, which of course attracted the Vikings. And their wealth consisted primarily of land, but also books, metalwork, grain, and cattle. And any notion that the Vikings were coming back every year for wonderful chalices and crosses and things like that, the first time they came, they lifted the lot. The second time, the monks hadn't time to remake the stuff. They were coming for grain. They were coming for all that was necessary for life. And the Vikings, of course, were a trading people, and eventually they would found Dublin, etc., etc. But back to the monasteries. The monasteries were constantly in need of reform. And there's a wonderful book produced by the Department of the Environment on Nendrum and about these horizontal mills, which are absolutely fascinating. We had them before the Chinese ever thought of them. But there's a section in that book, one chapter, on the bishops and the monks who lived in Nendrum. And if you ever want to drive yourself mad, read that chapter. It's impenetrable. And it's totally and utterly complicated. And you just say that you could sum it up by saying there was institutional confusion and lack of definition, which gives the impression that I understand everything I read. It's impossible. And then this monastic life, with its involvement with the political situation and everything, meant that the reforms were needed. And at the 8th century, we have a reform movement known as the Culdees. And then in the 12th century, we have Malachi, who tries to break the lay power of those who were responsible for administering the benefits of the church and restore them to the bishops. And that made him terribly popular, and he had great difficulty being let into Bangor to become the abbot to which to assume the abbacy to which he had been appointed. He then, of course, to complicate things, became Bishop of Connor, and then Archbishop of Armagh, and died as Bishop of Down while still living in Bangor. But in the meantime, he had become an international character because his friend Bernard of Clairvaux, who was the leading churchman of the 12th century, had written a wonderful biography of him. And by a set of unintended consequences, the biography of Malachy, written by Bernard of Clairvaux, in which, to emphasize the wondrous nature of Malachy, Bernard emphasized the deplorable state of the church in Ireland. And this was the very thing which was used by the Angevin king Henry II to justify his invasion of Ireland. He got the Pope to say that Henry could come to Ireland to reform the church. So enter the English, and they set up the Pale eventually, and they had great troubles dealing with the Irish, which of course would be news to us all. But there were, even before the Reformation, there were great divisions. There were some dioceses, Connor and Down were reserved for English priests, and Dromore was reserved for Irish priests. There were all sorts of ugly things that it was written in the side of one manuscript that it wasn't a sin. One man wrote that if he were going to say Mass and he met an Irishman on the way, he would kill him and go and continue to say Mass. So that indicates the depth of the pre-Reformation conflict between the English and the Irish in matters ecclesiastical. When the English came, they brought with them, especially in the great Norman de Courcy, they brought new foundations and the new orders, Grey Abbey and Newton Ards, Holywood, Bangor, filled with the new European orders, the Franciscans, the the Dominicans, and the Canons Regular, and the Augustinians, who had been brought in by Malachy. Then we move forward to the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries. This was the great land grab by the crown, and Henry VIII set that process both in England and in Ireland. And the monasteries by this time were ripe for reform again. And most of the abbots around here were Englishmen. And it was all due to who you know knew, etc., etc. So that when the monasteries were collapsed here, there wasn't that much in the line of resistance, because they weren't in the best of shape anyhow. Then the Tudors decide to try and conquer the whole of Ireland, and the last part of Ireland to be conquered was here. And we had the 9 Years' War, and finally, with the Battle of Kinsale, the complete defeat of Gaelic Ireland, and then in 1607 the flight of the Earls, and we had the plantation of Ulster, and the bit that the Antrim, Down and Monaghan were not planted by the government. That was a private deal done between Scots adventurers and James the Sixth and First. And we had an influx of Scottish Presbyterians, giving the particular character to Antrim and Down that we know today. It was in this time that the Franciscans came into their own, because it is not an exaggeration to say that without the Franciscans, Catholicism in Ireland would probably have perished. And one of the most significant people in that was our own Bishop Conor Devaney, native of Donegal, an old man who was part of or the victim of a plot to get a bishop and to eventually to make sure that the Catholic faith would be broken. And Conor Devaney was in Dublin and convicted after a show trial in which he delivered himself of the following famous phrase. He got into court and he refused to recognize the court. And the irate judge turned to him and said, "Even Jesus Christ recognized Pontius Pilate." To which Devaney replied, "If you are prepared to play the role of the latter, I would gladly play that of the former." And he didn't say a word after that. He was condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered with another younger priest called O'Loughlin. And their death, which they met with such courage, was deeply influential in Dublin at the time, and is credited with preventing Dublin adopting the new religion and remaining faithful to Rome. The problem then was, for Catholics were used to a sort of a very easygoing Catholic priesthood. And particularly in the area of marriage, the one thing that the Irish always resisted was a Roman view of marriage from the very beginning. And it was always a source of great worry. And there was an accommodation between the Irish clergy and the Irish laity. And then the new Protestant ministers arrived. And part of the thing that really annoyed the Irish was that these men were so mechanized. They had a definite religious program to impart. And it was in serious contrast to the more relaxed Catholic view that they were used to. So that worked against the new religion. But meanwhile, the Counter-Reformation was taking place. And when eventually the priests came back, they were every bit as mechanized as the Protestant ones, because they had learned from their methods and responded in the Counter-Reformation. And the Catholics, by remaining faithful to the Catholic Church, got more than they bargained for. They thought they were going back to the more relaxed way of pre-Reformation Catholicism, and it just simply wasn't going to be like that. So then we move on to the 17th century, and we have Cromwell and the Cromwellian land settlement, and then the War of the Three Kingdoms, 1690, the penal laws. The penal laws were not designed to destroy Catholicism. What they were designed to do was to control Catholicism. For the simple reason, if you imagined if everybody became a Protestant, then there was no advantage of being a Protestant. So, so the Catholics had to be kept in their place so that the Protestants who now controlled the majority of land in Ireland could enjoy their privileges. And that's why the penal laws, which are so dreadful on paper, weren't always too rigorously enforced. There were times when they were, but generally speaking, they weren't, because really the last thing that the Protestant ascendancy wanted was the Catholic population to convert. Then we come on to the 19th century, and we have Daniel O'Connell. This is after the French Revolution, and Daniel O'Connell does us, on the short term, a wonderful service, and I would argue, in the long term, a disservice. In the short term, he achieved Catholic emancipation, the removal of all the legal bars to Catholicism, except for admission to the university. And so then, but the problem was that how he achieved Catholic emancipation was to involve the Catholic Church in a mass political movement. And the Church got used to that and liked it. And that, I think, was the problem. So we then move on to the attempt to repeal the Union in the 19th century, and that doesn't work, and it's followed by the famine, that unbelievable catastrophe. And post-famine Ireland is a very different place from pre-famine Ireland. And then the rise of nationalism and the agitation for home rule, and the cultivation and the practice of already deep-seated sectarian tensions found expression in all the riots of the late 19th century, particularly in Belfast, and then there were the rural problems as well. Then we come to partition, and partition created two confessional states, and we sailed on, and then we came to the Troubles, and we don't need to dwell too much on the disastrous consequences and the awful things that happened in the Troubles. And here we are today. Now, in the middle of all this, we have the development of identity politics, and all of that, and that whole sexual problem that arose post-Second World War throughout particularly Europe and America. And then we have the abuse, clerical abuse crisis. And all of these coming together, the Troubles, identity politics, the abuse situation, the issues of urbanization and industrialization, they all combine to create a very different church. And there are issues. People always talked about the political leadership of the church. Now, was the church, when it was in its political heyday, leading are following. Did the power of leadership the church have consist in the fact that it was accurately representing the opinions of Catholics in the pew? And do we see, for instance, in is there a link? These are questions which are obviously open to passionate discussion. But when we think of Bishop Cahill Daly in his extreme denunciation of IRA republicanism, etc., and we also notice a deep decline in religious practice in the Republican areas of the city, is that cause and effect? Or is it due to the other issues that I've mentioned? And in earlier times, it's argued that, say in the Parnell split, there were some bishops who were very pro-Parnell, others who were anti-Parnell. And it's happened that the pro-Parnell bishops were in places where their people were largely pro-Parnell, and vice versa. So the issue of the political power of the church is, I think, something well worth investigating. Now, we've talked about a Christian tradition. The Christian tradition that we have experienced in Ireland, and particularly in this world, since the Reformation, has been heavily influenced by the arrival of Protestantism, particularly Presbyterianism. And that affects how we practice our religion in strange ways. It's interesting that unlike other parts of Ireland, there is a certain, how would I put it, there isn't the same commitment to the external practices of religion, yes, in terms of processions and things like that. Right, so that says to me, time's up. But just I'll finish by saying, so we have to bear in mind this context in which we live, with its very many positive aspects, but also very many negative aspects, because we're well aware of the whole history of sectarianism and discrimination, etc., etc. And that has a deep effect on how we view the world and how we view the state, how we view our practice. Vatican II has given us an openness in ecumenism, and we see at the moment we are now in a period of reorganization because of the reduction of the number of clergy, the development of co-responsibility, which was enunciated by Pope Benedict XVI. We shouldn't get too hot and bothered about church reorganization in Ireland, because it's a very slow process. The last major time we organized in the 12th century, it took 200 years for the thing to settle down. So we're not going to, everything we do is necessarily provisional. The central aspect of our Christian tradition is the spiritual life, our devotion to word and sacrament, the encouragement of personal holiness and collective worship. But all of these are very different from what they were 100 years ago. And we have to be like, when we're looking at tradition and seeing as a living tradition, we have to be like the storeholder, the householder who goes to his store and takes out things which are old and new. We have a living tradition, but that tradition is actually bound up with the person of Jesus Christ. And that's whom we are trying to pass on, not a series of doctrines and dogmas, but our living response to the reality of Jesus Christ. And even our doctrines and dogmas are always minimalist. And every generation, we are children of our time. But that is always seen in the context that as human beings, we are incarnate spirit. And we're always in crisis. The church is always in crisis. The church always needs to be reformed. And that gives us an edge to the way we live, but also in all of this confusion and movement and looking back and forward at the same time, all the confusion, all the turmoil, there is a quiet center. That quiet center is the abiding presence of Christ, who told us that in this world you will have trouble, but do not be afraid. I am with you until the end of time. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you very much, Canon, for such an inspiring talk, and certainly food for thought for everybody. We have a roving mic this week, so if anyone would like to maybe take a few minutes, Father, put a few questions to you from what we've heard here tonight. Robert has the mic, so he'll take us round indeed. Thank you. Anybody like to kick off? Margaret, Robert, just a minute, Margaret, we get the mic.
Wanted to know a little bit more about the pre-Reformation view on marriage and that sort of more gentle view that you talked about. What was that view?
It's first of all, in the medieval period, if I wanted to get married, I walked up to you and said, would you like to marry me? And you would say to me, yes, I would like to marry you. Would you like to marry me? Yes, and that was it. And which was great, no fuss. But then children would come along, people would fall out, and then who's that child belong to? Not me. And away you went. And that was why when, after centuries of trying, eventually in the Council of Trent, the rule was set up that to be a valid marriage has to be conducted in front of a priest and two witnesses. In the Irish, in the pre-Christian law, basically it was not quite a free-for-all, but divorce and remarriage and everything like that was more acceptable because you had stronger family groups to absorb the people. But the constant complaint pre-Reformation was about the Irish, shall we say, untroubled way of looking at marriage regulations. Well, I would start by going very far afield before coming to this, and say that the conversion of Ireland was of world significance because the greatest empire ever known was the Roman Empire. Ireland was not part of the Roman Empire. So when Ireland was converted, it went to show that the kingdom of God was greater than the greatest power that had ever been. So that was the international significance of the conversion of Ireland. And then when we come here, the arrival of the monks and all that they brought with them was, first of all, they brought major cultural change. Because Latin arrived, we had writing. Before we had the Ogham script, which was a cumbersome way of writing. Now we had alphabets and access to a whole world of learning. And what is the most significant thing? I think the hope that these monasteries gave, because if you ask yourself, when you arrive in a strange place, how do you start to evangelize? And you've your personal thing, but also you need cooperation from events. And one of the great, they believe is one of the great things that helped focus people's mind on our religion was the fact that there was a plague in the 7th century, in 6th century Ireland, and that meant with people dying like flies, people were being asked all the time, what was the value of life? What was the point of life? And these monks arrived, and they had a disciplined, overarching view which talked about the importance of life in this world and life in the next. And by coming, and I think that's what I would consider the most, the hope that they gave in a country which was being devastated by a plague. And that was the catalyst, or not the catalyst, the motor that gave the hope, and it's the hope, I think, which sustains the whole monastic movement. So I've reduced you to silence. I can do. I think, you know, the challenge is the same as it is in every generation. How to convey the hope and the love of Christ, and in the real situation in which we find ourselves. And those change. I mean, if I were to go around and ask everybody here about what's important in their lives, I'd get a whole range of answers, and yet everyone is coming with that. I suppose maybe it's Blessed Carlo Acutis, this 15-year-old boy who died in 2006. He has a whole lot. He's a computer whiz kid, and he had a wonderful saying. But he said that we're all born originals, but most of us die as photocopies. And I suppose that's the challenge, that we each recognize that we are unique human beings, and we haven't to spend our lives trying to be someone we're not, trying to be ourselves. And from a Catholic perspective, another thing he said, and I repeated this today to a group of children who were 8 and 9, when he was 8 and 9, he delivered himself with this wonderful statement, which I think is this fabulous insight for a 9-year-old child. He said, wasn't God very clever to hide himself in a piece of bread? And, you know, that's what we have a message of faith, and we've to rely on people who are rooted in the world that we live in, trying to make sense of it and to live it like the rest of us. I don't know if that's any sort of an answer.
Monasteries all over the place. Sorry.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the monks is that there are no martyrs in the early Irish Church. So they came in and they were able to adapt. And the secret of the adapting was apparently that they recognized the political situation that there was, that all the local kingdoms, and they recognized them, and then they got bits and pieces of land, very often given to them by the local families, and then they started up, and they grew, and because they, as well as their spiritual and approach, that they brought so much with them. They could bring education, and they could bring the medicine, the hospital, and develop into all of those things, so that they were a positive advantage. And as long as they didn't cause too much trouble on the political front, then they had free rein, and they were an asset to any community.
Were there many Canon monks, or I mean, that's an awful lot of work, but people who create that, what they created, does it come just a couple? Do you know number-wise? Was it just like a 10 monks came together?
I think it depends on each circumstance. The only one that I know isn't an Irish one. It's when Bernard of Clairvaux, when he founded Citeaux, he arrived with 12 of his brothers, blood brothers, and set up. So they would have come, like Comgall is known as one of the 12 founders of Christianity in Ireland, along with Kieran of Clonmacnoise and others. And they would have started off very often as pupils and moved out. Columbanus would have moved from his native Leinster up to Cleanish and Lough Erne, then from Cleanish to Lough Erne to Bangor. But they were following well-beaten paths at that stage. But what is remarkable is how quickly these paths set up. And I think that this goes back to the importance of this plague, that people were looking for were disposed to thinking about life, death, and the meaning and the meaning of life.
Can I just ask, you didn't talk much about St. Patrick. Is that
St. Patrick. How many St. Patricks were there? They think there were 3. And so St. Patrick is obviously a real person, but he's had piles of myths put on him. He may not have been as significant as he is portrayed, but he's portrayed because in the later centuries, Armagh was trying to establish itself, and it beefed up the picture we have of Malachy. And it's not a very pleasant topic to discover, that all these monasteries are pushing their man. But Patrick was certainly pushed by Armagh, and then Armagh, of course, became the primatial see of all Ireland. And so you've all of that, how would I put it, ecclesiastical empire building. And if you had a good saint, you made the best use of him. And Patrick was a subject of that, and he won. Yeah.
That technology, where did we fall behind? Why was that technology not shared out?
I just don't know, but I don't know if any of you, if you know Nendrum, but when you go to Nendrum and you look at the loch, you'll see 2 barriers. They built a dam. And then I think that was 789, and then 814 they built a smaller one. And the result, because the water flow is so fast, they were able to get the water come as it came in, to turn the mills, and then as it went out, it kept turning the mills, so that the monks had energy for these mills for 20 hours a day. And they used that to grind the corn from all the area. That was and they ground it for the other 2 monasteries. And the links of these monasteries, they keep discovering these. My favourite story is the Columban monasteries on the continent. One of the ways that they kept a link with the mother house of Bangor was that they used ink made in Bangor. The ink was exported all to the Columban house, and they made ink by crushing holly, and I think there was acorns. There was a time, I'm a sad man, I knew the recipe, but I don't know it anymore. But these links, and then there's a whole history that is being developed, the links between these three things. But the technology in Nendrum is absolutely mind-blowing. And I was asked to write a review of a book containing all sorts of technical stuff, and I had to work very hard to understand it. But even to a non-engineer like me, it's just fabulous. And there is an interpretive centre there, which is more often closed than open. But if you go there, and also you get a wonderful sight of what the Irish monasteries were, that they were 3 concentric circles. You can see it best in Nendrum, but you can also see it in Bangor from the air. One half of the monastic site was stripped of stone to build houses opposite the monastery, but on the right hand side, from the air, you can see the remaining shapes of the 3 circles. And these circles were Sanctus, Sanctor, Sanctissimus, Holy, Holier, and Holiest. And you would have on the outer side lay people and their families doing work. Then you would have a different set of people involved with the monastic site, and then in the centre you would have the church and the abbot's cell. Again, beautifully explained in Nendrum. And another thing for which a German, shortly after I came to Bangor, a very excited German rang me up wanting to know about the continuous prayer of Bangor. And I hadn't a clue what he was talking about. Eventually I found out that there was 24-hour recitation of the Psalms in Bangor, because there were so many monks and the church was so small that they just kept going. The laus perennis, the continuous praise of God. And so this excited German rang me in the hope that I would be able to enlighten him. And you now know as much about the laus perennis as I do. But apparently it was very, very significant. Because if any serious study on Irish monasticism has to start with German scholars. The Germans have done fabulous work, and even one of the greatest archaeologists and was Beeler in UCD in Dublin, who was German. The Germans they're fabulous. Yes?
There's a very strong tradition in Northern and Orange that incorporates all the different religious denominations, and there's very much a feeling of shared heritage. And it was certainly my understanding that from the likes of the monks coming in, that was something that was accepted by the religious handed down, and we do have different denominations here tonight. They who would have understood about the tradition of what the monks, their holiness, their preference, what it brought, that's not a shared heritage. Would you be able to speak on that for the benefit?
That insight and question absolutely delights me. because that's precisely what we're trying to do with Columbanus. The beauty about the monks is their pre-Reformation. So we don't have that, the divisions are there. And we can, first of all, find common roots. And we can, there are two great prayers in this area. Obviously, the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer. But also the second one is the Gloria, which was written by Pope Symmachus in 150. But the earliest written record of this prayer is in the Bangor antiphonary, which was obviously written in Bangor and now resides in the Ambrosian Library in Milan. And that Columbanus, and I'm so anxious to promote all of this precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, that it is a binding, unifying force of common Christianity, and it's so enriching. And when you read some of the things of Columbanus, who is presented very often as a very severe character. But I read an article the other night by an English historian, and she said this image of Columbanus as controversialist comes from the few documents that we have about him that he wrote himself, but there were other documents. The reason that they were maintained was precisely because of their controversial nature. There are other writings. Columbanus, in the letter that he wrote to his community when he was being forced out of France, there's a beautiful tenderness in it. And this is the Columbanus who was able to write a wonderful sentence: trust in the gentleness of God. And anything that can bring us to an understanding of the gentleness of God is something that I think all Christians can be at home with. And there's a lovely Presbyterian saying, which we accept light from any quarter. And I think that's a wonderful motto. And I think, as Christians, particularly in the divided society in which we live, that's a wonderful motto to live by, to accept light from any quarter, to look where the light is. And the monks, Columbanus, Comgall, they give us so much. And in the Church of Ireland in Bangor, they have a window to St. Mirren, who also came from Bangor. And when you I went to a monastery for a retreat on the Loire River one time, and the historian in the abbey asked me where I was from, and when I said Bangor, his reaction was this: Bangor, Bangor, Bangor. And I thought to myself, but it turned out that this monastery was one of 50 that we know at the moment, which ran on a Benedictine and Columban rule at the same time. So that the influence of Bangor and this part of the world is quite remarkable. And even later on, when you had St. Kilian going to Germany, they're always known as the Scottish Irish, the Scots-Irish. And it was always said that if there was a holy person about and they weren't sure where they came from, they were given the benefit of the doubt and described as Irish. And the Bishop of Würzburg wrote a wonderful book on St. Kilian, and he described the Irish religious genius. The Irish religious genius, he argued, was the ability to personalize things. We're very good at personalizing, for good or bad. But he gave us an example: the three wise men in the Gospel of Luke. They have no names. The Irish monks gave them names. Melchior, Christo, and was it Belshazzar? And yeah, because but on the back doors of German houses in Bavaria, every Christmas they write Caspar, Melchior, and I've forgotten the other. Was the third one? But Belshazzar. So they will write cross C, cross M, cross B, just to celebrate the feast of the three kings. But he was going back to the fact that the Irish monks weren't happy with things unless they were personalized. There's this idea to humanize. And so again, another thing that is vital in any human relations, but trying just to make it real, to make it concrete. Our attitude is that we start from the concrete and arrive at the theoretical. The French idea is to start at the theoretical and arrive at the concrete. There's a famous crack. The French will say, we know it works in practice, but does it work in theory? Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it's just simply because what you're talking about is what want. Yeah. Sorry for going on so long at that.
There is a cup of tea or coffee in Iona, please, and particularly you're very welcome to take a cup of tea if you have time. Could I just maybe give you a date for your diary for December? Next month on the 14th, we hope to welcome Sisters Martina Purdy and Sister Elaine Kelly. Now, you might remember these two ladies gave up very successful careers about 12 years ago. One was a BBC journalist, Martina, and Elaine was a practicing barrister. And they gave up those careers to join a religious order. Now, they are going to come and speak to us about, I suppose, their faith journey and about the pathways since. And that's on Wednesday, the 14th of December at 7:30 here. And I hope we'll see plenty of people up from our neighbouring parishes as well. Thank you very much.